What's up, everyone? This is the Next Day Podcast, episode 67 with Mikel
And Tanyka,
where we have where we have conversations on different topics. What type of topic are we having today, Tanyka?
we are actually going to be talking about Martin Luther King. It's Martin Luther King Day, and that's what we're going to be talking about.
Okay. All right. Let's get to it.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, and he died on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. He was a Baptist minister and a social activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States from the mid-1950s until his death by assassination in 1968. His leadership was fundamental to that movement's success in ending the legal segregation of African Americans in the South and other parts of the United States. King rose to national prominence as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which promoted nonviolent tactics such as the massive March on Washington, which was in 1963, to achieve civil rights. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. So let's kind of go through his early life a little bit. So King came from a comfortable middle-class family steeped in the tradition of the Southern Black ministry. Both his father and his maternal grandfather were Baptist preachers. His parents were college-educated, and King's father had succeeded his father-in-law as pastor of the prestigious Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. The family lived in Auburn Avenue, otherwise known as Sweet Auburn, the bustling Black Wall Street home to some of the country's largest and most prosperous Black businesses and Black churches in the years before the Civil Rights Movement. Young Martin received a solid education and grew up in a loving extended family. This secure upbringing, however, did not prevent King from experiencing the prejudices then common in the South. He never forgot the time when, at about 6 years old, one of his white playmates announced that his parents would no longer allow him to play with King because the children were now attending segregated schools. So, dearest to King in these early years was his maternal grandmother, whose death in 1941 left him shaken and unstable. Upset because he had learned of her fatal heart attack while attending a parade without his parents' permission, the 12-year-old King attempted suicide by jumping from a second-story window. That's horrific.
Yeah.
In 1944, at age 15, King entered Morehouse College in Atlanta under a special wartime program intended to boost enrollment by admitting promising high school students like King. Before beginning college, however, King spent the summer on a tobacco farm in Connecticut. It was his first extended stay away from home and his first substantial experience of race relations outside the segregated South. He was shocked by how peacefully the races mixed in the North, saying, quote, "Negroes and whites go to the same church." And he noted this in a letter to his parents. He further went to say, "I never thought that a person of my race could eat anywhere, because as we know, some places, especially in the South, were no blacks allowed, whites only."
Mm-hmm.
So this summer experience in the North only deepened King's growing hatred of racial segregation.
Mm-hmm.
At Morehouse, King favored studies in medicine and law, but these were eclipsed in his senior year by a decision to enter the ministry, as his father had urged. King's mentor at Morehouse was the college president Benjamin Mays, who was a social gospel activist whose rich oratory and progressive ideas had left an undeniable imprint on King's father. Committed to fighting racial inequality, Mays accused the African American community of complacency in the face of oppression, and he prodded the Black church into social action by criticizing its emphasis on the hereafter instead of the here and now. It was a call to service that was not lost on the teenage King, which I think definitely probably pushed him into what he would become.
Yeah.
He graduated from Morehouse in 1948. King spent the next 3 years at Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, where he became acquainted with Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, as well as with the thought of contemporary Protestant theologians. He earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1951. Renowned for his oratorical skills, King was elected president of Crozer's student body, which was composed almost exclusively of white students. As a professor at Crozer wrote in a letter of recommendation for King, saying, quote, "The fact that with our student body largely Southern in constitution, a colored man should be elected to be popular in such a position is in of itself no means recommendation." So from there, King went to Boston University, where in seeking a firm foundation for his own theological and ethical inclinations, he studied man's relationship to God and received a doctorate in 1955 for a dissertation titled "A Comparison of the Conceptions of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wieman." So, long title. While in Boston, King met Coretta Scott, who was a native Alabamian. She was from Alabama, who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. So they were married in 1953 and had 4 children. King had been pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, slightly more than a year when the city's small group of civil rights advocates decided to contest racial segregation on that city's public bus system following the incident on December 1st, 1955, in which a person I think we all know, Rosa Parks, who was an African-American woman, had refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger, and as a consequence was arrested for violating the city's segregation law. Activists formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to boycott the transit system and chose King as their leader. He had the advantage of being a young, well-trained man who was too new in town to have made enemies. He was generally respected, and it was thought that his family connections and professional standing would enable him to find another pastorate, I think that's how you say it, should the boycott fail. In his first speech to the group, as its president, King declared, quote, "We have no alternative but to protest. For many years, we have shown an amazing patience. We have sometimes given our white brothers the feeling that we liked the way we were being treated, but we come here tonight to be saved from that patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice." So these words introduced to the country a fresh voice, a skillful rhetoric, and an inspiring personality, and in time, a dynamic new doctrine of civil struggle. Although King's home was dynamited, that a word, and his, bombed, and his family's safety threatened, He continued to lead the boycott until 1 year and a few weeks later, the city's buses were desegregated. So don't give up, basically. Recognizing the need for a mass movement to capitalize on the successful Montgomery action, King set about organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which gave him a base of operation throughout the South, as well as a national platform from which to speak. King lectured in all parts of the country and discussed race-related issues with religious and civil rights leaders at home and abroad. In February 1959, he and his party were warmly received by India's Prime Minister, I'm going to butcher this, Jawaharlal Nehru. Great, I tried.
Yeah, it's a long name. Yeah.
And others, as the result of a brief discussion with followers of Gandhi about the Gandhian concepts of peaceful noncompliance. King became increasingly convinced that nonviolent resistance was the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom. King also looked to Africa for inspiration, saying, quote, "The liberation struggle in Africa has been the greatest single international influence on American Negro students. Frequently, I hear them say that if their African brothers can break the bonds of colonism, surely the American Negro can break Jim Crow." In 1960, King and his family moved to his native city of Atlanta, where he became co-pastor with his father of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. At this post, he devoted most of his time to the SCLC and the civil rights movement, declaring that the psychological moment has come when a concentrated drive against injustice can bring great tangible gains. His thesis was soon tested as he agreed to support the sit-in demonstrations undertaken by local Black college students. In late October, he was arrested with 33 young people protesting segregation at the lunch counter in an Atlanta department store. I do remember seeing this in like movies and whatnot. Charges were dropped, but King was sentenced to Reedsville State Prison Farm on the pretext that he had violated his probation on a minor traffic offense committed several months earlier. Right. The case assumed national proportions with widespread concern over his safety, outrage at Georgia's flouting of legal forms, and the failure of President Dwight D. Eisenhower to intervene. King was released only upon the intercession of Democratic presidential candidate John F. Kennedy, an action so widely publicized that it was felt to have contributed substantially to Kennedy's slender election victory 8 days later. In the years from 1960 to 1965, King's influence reached its zenith. Handsome, eloquent, and doggedly determined, King quickly caught the attention of the news media, particularly of the producers of that budding medium of social change, being television. He understood the power of television to nationalize and internationalize the struggle for civil rights, and his well-publicized tactics of active nonviolence, sit-ins, protest marches, aroused the devoted allegiance of many African Americans and liberal whites in all parts of the country, as well as support from the administrations of Presidents Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. But there were also notable failures, as in Albany, Georgia, not Albany, New York, when King and his colleagues failed to achieve their desegregation goals. Where did I go here? Sorry, for public parks and other facilities. In Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963, King's campaign to end segregation at lunch counters and in hiring practices drew nationwide attention when police turned dogs and fire hoses on the demonstrators. So, dogs and fire hoses. King was jailed along with large numbers of his supporters, including hundreds of school children. So, people are arresting kids. Okay. His supporters did not, however, include all of the black clergy of Birmingham, and he was strongly opposed by some of the white clergy who had issued a statement urging African Americans not to support the demonstrations. From the Birmingham jail, King wrote a letter of great eloquence in which he spelled out his philosophy of nonviolence, saying, quote, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Is a negotiation a better path? You're quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." Near the end of the Birmingham campaign, in an effort to draw together the multiple forces for peaceful change and to dramatize to the country and to the world the importance of solving the U.S. racial problem, King joined other civil rights leaders in organizing the historic March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, an interracial assembly of more than 200,000 gathered peacefully in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all citizens under the law. Here, the crowds were uplifted by the emotional strength and quality of King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which I will be reading at the end, in which he emphasized his faith that all men someday would be brothers. The rising tide of civil rights agitation produced, as King had hoped, a strong effect on national opinion and resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, authorizing the federal government to enforce desegregation of public accommodations and outlawing discrimination in publicly owned facilities as well as in employment. The eventful year was climaxed by the award to King of the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in December, saying, quote, "I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America, an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness, I think is what he's trying to say here, of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the internal oughtness that forever confronts him." The first signs of opposition to King's tactics from within the civil rights movement surfaced during March of 1965. Demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, which were aimed at dramatizing the need for a federal voting rights law that would provide legal support for the enfranchisement of African Americans in the South. King organized an initial march from Selma to the state capitol building in Montgomery, but did not lead it himself. Led by John Lewis and Hosea Williams, on March 7th, the marchers were turned back by state troopers with nightsticks and tear gas. Captured on television, the brutal scene became known as Bloody Sunday. King was determined to lead a second march 2 days later, despite an injunction by a federal court and efforts from Washington to persuade him to cancel it. Heading a procession of 1,500 marchers, black and white, he set out across Paytas Bridge outside Selma until the group came to a barricade of state troopers. Just side note, for those who haven't seen the movie Selma, highly recommend. It was really good, and they kind of obviously go through the struggles of actually just doing the march. It's a really good movie.
Yeah, it is a really good movie. I saw it in theaters with my family,
Oh,
and
you saw
it's
it in theaters. I didn't
yeah,
even see it in
yeah,
theaters, but
yeah. I saw it. Yeah.
yeah, it's a really good movie. I think Oprah's directed it or whatever. Oprah's a part of it. But
Yeah, she was. I think she was the actor in it too. I'm
I
really
think
forget.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. So and the producer role as well. So
Yeah. Um, but instead of going on and forcing a confrontation, he led his followers to kneel in prayer and then unexpectedly turned back. This decision cost King the support of many young radicals who were already faulting him for being too cautious. The suspicion of an arrangement with federal and local authorities, vigorously but not entirely convincingly denied, clung to the Selma affair. The country was nevertheless aroused, resulting in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout the nation, impatience with the lack of greater substantive progress encouraged the growth of Black militancy, especially in the poorest areas of the large northern cities. King's religious philosophy of nonviolence was increasingly questioned. The rioting in the Watts district of Los Angeles in August 1965 demonstrated the depth of unrest among urban African Americans. In an effort to make the challenge of urban poverty, King and his forces initiated a drive against racial discrimination in Chicago at the beginning of the following year. The chief target was to be segregation in housing. After spring and summer of rallies, marches, and demonstrations, an agreement was signed between the city and a coalition of African Americans, liberals, and labor organizations called calling for various measures to enforce the existing laws and regulations with respect to housing. Okay, but this agreement was to have little effect. The impression remained that King's Chicago campaign was nullified, partly because of the opposition of that city's powerful mayor, Richard J. Daley, and partly because of the unexpected complexities of Northern racism. In Illinois and Mississippi alike, King was now being challenged and even publicly derided by young Black Power enthusiasts. Whereas King stood for patience, middle class, respectability, and a measured approach to social change, the sharp-tongued, blue jean-clad young urban radicals stood for confrontation and immediate change. In the latter's eyes, the suit-wearing, calm-spoken civil rights leader was irresponsibly passive and old, damn, beyond his years. King was in his 30s, so it's really nice
Mhm.
when I'm in my 30s and when people are saying he's old. It's really mean.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, more than a member of the other side of the generation gap than their revolutionary leader. Malcolm X went so far as to call King's tactics criminal, which is hilarious, seeing as I would think the same of Malcolm X. And if you're unsure what we're talking, we did talk about Malcolm X actually last year. Mikel talked about him, so
Yeah. Then briefly, yeah. During our Black History Month theme.
right.
Yeah.
So I find Malcolm X's tactics to be closer to criminal than Martin Luther King, but okay, sure.
Mhm.
So he said, Malcolm X said, concerning nonviolence, it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks. I don't think that's what Martin Luther King is saying, but okay.
So what is he saying again? Repeat that.
So Malcolm X
Mhm.
said that concerning nonviolence, because Martin Luther King tends to have or tended to have more of a nonviolence approach
Yeah.
to the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
He says that it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks,
Mm,
which that is not what he was saying. I think obviously you need to defend yourself if
yeah.
you're being attacked.
Y-
Absolutely.
Yeah. I just think that Martin Luther King was solely against like, violence. Like,
In terms of the civil
he just
rights
want
movement, I
yeah,
would,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, he was just very, very peaceful. And
exactly.
like, and also he was also Christian, right? If I believe.
I believe he
Or
Baptist. He
Catholic.
was Baptist.
Baptist. Baptist? Okay. Okay.
But
So
I mean, under
yeah.
the umbrella,
That
nonetheless, of Christianity. But um,
yeah.
Malcolm X. I mean, again, I don't want to put the religion into it because I think
Uh-huh.
that just feeds into the the narrative that Islam is dangerous and people who are Muslim are dangerous. But that's not it. Because if we remember from what you talked about with Malcolm X, is the person that he, I guess, looked up to or something. I can't remember
Right.
the right terminology.
Right.
Was nonviolent. So I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah. He was just basically fighting for this peaceful movement and not a violent movement. So like
Yeah. Because then again,
I
Malcolm
just
X
think
is
yeah.
remembered in his
hmm
way.
hmm hmm
And Martin Luther King, I think, is remembered in his way. And
Yeah.
both parties did a lot
Yeah.
for the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
So,
So they had their
um,
yeah.
no, go ahead. You were gonna
No,
say,
yeah, they had their problems back in the day. So like basically everyone knew about it and
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
everybody thinks differently. So yeah.
So, in the face of mounting criticism, King broadened his approach to include concerns other than racism. So, on April 4th, 1967, a Riverside church in New York City, and again on the 15th at a mammoth peace rally in that city, he committed himself irrevocably to opposing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. I would say that's the greatest approach, but history would say that America still took part in the Vietnam War. We're not going to get into it. Anyway, once
Right.
before, in early January 1966, he had condemned the war, but official outrage from Washington and strenuous opposition within the Black community itself had caused him to relent. He next sought to widen his base by forming a coalition of the poor of all races that would address itself to economic problems such as poverty and unemployment. It was a version populism seeking to enroll janitors, hospital workers, seasonal laborers, and the destitute of Appalachia, whichever way you want to say it, along with the student militants and pacifists, intellectuals. His endeavors along these lines, however, did not engender such support in any segment of the population. Meanwhile, the strain and changing dynamics of the civil rights movement had taken a toll on King, especially in the final months of his life. He said, frankly, I'm tired of marching. I'm tired of going to jail. He'd been in 1968. Living every day under the threat of death, I feel discouraged every now and then and feel my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. King's plans for a poor people's march to Washington were interrupted in the spring of 1968 by a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of a strike by that city's sanitation workers. In the opinion of many of his followers and biographers, King seemed to sense his end was near. As King you know what? I won't try to say that word. As King told a crowd at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis on April 3rd, the night before he died, he said, quote, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The next day, while standing on the second-story balcony of the Lorraine Motel, where he and his associates were staying, King was killed by a sniper's bullet. The killing sparked riots and disturbances in over 100 cities across the country. On March 10th, 1969, the accused assassin, a white man, James Earl Ray, pleaded guilty at the murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Good riddance. Ray later recanted his confession, of course he did, claiming lawyers had coerced him into confessing and that he was the victim of a conspiracy. Okay, in a surprising turn of events, members of the King family eventually came to Ray's defense. King's son, Dexter, met with the reputed assassin in March of 1997 and then publicly joined Ray's plea for a reopening of his case. When Ray died on April 23rd, 1998, Coretta Scott King, his wife, declared, "America will never have the benefit of Mr. Ray's trial, which would have produced new revelations about the assassination, as well as established the facts concerning Mr. Ray's innocence." See, the only way that I could ever think he was maybe innocent or not the brains behind the assassination is if someone paid him off, someone paid him to do it,
Right.
him as a scapegoat. That's the only way. And maybe that is what happened. I don't know. Although the U.S. government conducted several investigations into the murder of King, and each time concluded that Ray was the sole assassin, the killing remains a matter of controversy. In the years after his death, King remained the most widely known African American leader of his era. His stature was a major historical figure, was confirmed by the successful campaign to establish a national holiday in his honor in the United States, and by the building of a King Memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C., near the Lincoln Memorial, the site of his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. Many states and municipalities have enacted King's holidays, authorized public statues and paintings of him, and named streets, schools, and other entities for him. These efforts to honor King have focused more on his role as a civil rights advocate than on his controversial speeches during his final year, condemning American intervention in Vietnam and calling for the Poor People's Campaign. The King Holiday campaign overcame forceful opposition, with critics citing FBI surveillance files suggesting that King was an adulterous radical influenced by communists. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
So, yeah. Well,
adulterous, I can maybe understand.
Yeah.
King was not maybe always faithful to his wife, and that part's not surprising.
Yeah.
The rest is.
Yeah. Sure.
Like, although the release of these files during the 1970s under the Freedom of Information Act, so someone did a FOIA search, fueled the public debate over King's legacy. The extensive archives that now exist document King's life and thought and have informed numerous serious studies offering balanced and comprehensive perspectives. Two major books featuring King, one by David J. Garrows called Bearing the Cross, which was written in 1986, and one by Taylor Branch, and that one's called Parting the Waters, and that was 1988, won Pulitzer Prizes. Subsequent books and articles reaffirmed King's historical significance while portraying him as a complex figure, flawed, fallible, and limited in his control over the mass movements with which he was associated. yet also a visionary leader who was deeply committed to achieving social justice through nonviolent means.
Yeah.
Um, so
Y- So yeah, the, going back to the holiday, this took 32 years to campaign.
oh yeah,
32 years.
not surprised. I don't think it would have been an easy thing
Yeah, because perhaps it has background, basically,
because he's a black
and
man.
that too, and I'll know there as well. Black man,
Black
and
man.
yeah, um, I,
I mean,
and it,
we've
yeah,
as black people, we've come a long way,
yeah,
but we still have so much work to do.
uh-huh,
And especially in the 70s, 80s, we weren't, black people still, we were nowhere near where we are now.
uh-huh.
And that's not saying a lot, honestly. So, yeah, that's not surprising that it took that long.
Yeah. It was made official from all 50 states in the year 2000.
Not surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Sad.
So,
So, although the idea of a king national holiday did not gain significant congressional support until the late 1970s, efforts to, celebrate his life began almost immediately after his assassination. In 1968, John Conyers of Michigan, I think he's a representative, introduced a King holiday bill. The idea gradually began to attract political support once the newly formed Congressional Black Caucus included the holiday in its reform agenda. Coretta Scott King also played a central role in building popular support for the King Holiday campaign while serving as founding president of the Atlanta-based Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, later renamed the King Center, which became one of the major archives of King's papers. Despite the overall conservative trend in American politics in the 1980s, which might have been expected to work against recognition of the efforts of a oh my god, I can't talk now, controversial activist, King holiday advocates gained political support by portraying him as a symbol of the country's progress in race relations. Musician Stevie Wonder contributed to the campaign by writing and recording "Happy Birthday," his version of "Happy
was
Birthday."
that the reason why he wrote
I
that?
didn't know that. Didn't know that, but yeah, I guess
Wow.
so. I had no clue. Happy birthday to ya. Happy. Okay. A popular tribute to King. In 1983, Coretta Scott King and Stevie Wonder participated in the 20th anniversary march on Washington, which drew a bigger crowd than the original march. After the House and the Senate voted overwhelmingly in favor of the King holiday bill sponsored by Senator Ted Kennedy, President Ronald Reagan put aside his initial doubts and signed the legislation on November 3rd, 1983, establishing Martin Luther King Jr. Day to be celebrated annually on the third Monday in January. Coretta Scott King also succeeded in gaining congressional approval to establish a King federal holiday commission to plan annual celebrations beginning January 20th, 1986, that would encourage Americans to reflect on the principles of racial equality and nonviolent social change exposed by Dr. King. Celebration of the King national holiday did not end contention over King's legacy, but his status as an American icon became more widely accepted over time. The revelation during the early 1990s that King had plagiarized some of his academic writings and the occasional controversies involving his heirs did little to undermine recognition of King's enduring impact on the country. Even before the first King national holiday, members of King's fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha have proposed a permanent memorial in Washington, D.C. By the end of the 20th century, that proposal had secured governmental approval for the site on the tidal basin near the mall. In 2000, an international design competition ended with the selection of a proposal by Roma Design Group to build and maintain the memorial. The Martin Luther King Jr. National Memorial Project Foundation eventually raised more than $100 million. Commemorations of King's life were also held in other countries, and in 2009, a congressional delegation traveled to India to mark the 50th anniversary of King's pilgrimage to what he called the land of Gandhi. As with the lives of other major historical figures, King's life has been interpreted in new ways by successive generations of scholars, many of whom have drawn attention to the crucial role of local Black leaders in the African American protest movements of the 1950s and 60s, recognizing that grassroots activists such as Rosa Parks, Fred Shuttlesworth, the others prepared the way for King's rise to national prominence. Biographers and historians have questioned the view that Southern Black protest movements relied on King's charismatic guidance. Nonetheless, studies of King continue to acknowledge his distinctive leadership role. For example, though he often downplayed his contribution to the Montgomery bus boycott, King's inspirational leadership and his speeches helped to transform a local protest over bus seating into a historically important event. More generally, studies of King have suggested that his most significant contribution to the modern African American freedom struggle was to link Black aspirations to transcendent, widely shared democratic and Christian ideals. While helping grassroots leaders mobilize African Americans for sustained mass struggles, he inspired participants to believe that their cause was just and consistent with traditional American egalitarian values. King also appealed to the consciousness of all Americans, thus building popular support for civil rights reform. His strategy of emphasizing nonviolent protests and interracial cooperation enabled him to fight effectively against the Southern system of legalized racial segregation and discrimination, but also proved inadequate during his final years as he sought to overcome racial and economic problems that were national in scope. So, as said, I was going to read the I Have a Dream speech, which I think we can all agree was one of his most popular speeches, most well-known speeches. And I mean, it's been used in also popular culture. So yeah, it was this, so we can say, we kind of mentioned already. It was delivered on August 28th, 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Right. So here's that speech. So 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of grandulism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. The sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolts will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful peace, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is intrinsically bond to our freedom. We cannot walk alone, and as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto for a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating "for whites only." We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somewhere the situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair, I say to you today, my friends. So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of opposition, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right down in Alabama, little black boys and black girls, we will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. I think I'm going to end it there just because it is really long, but if you want to read the whole thing, it is there. It's on NPR. I read most of it, but it is there on NPR if you want to read the entire speech. But yeah, I'm going to end it off there.
That was Martin Luther King's speech, and hope you guys enjoyed the speech. And
Again,
um,
that was most of the speech, but I'm just,
yeah.
yeah.
I know it was most of the speech, but like you learn from it. You basically educate yourself from the speech, and also his what he's done in the past as well. What not what he's done in his personal life. Don't look at that as I'm sure like not everybody in America was the perfect person.
Oh, no
Like,
one's perfect. That doesn't
yeah, yeah.
exist.
So, we don't look at Martin Luther King as a perfect person, but what he did for, Black, uh, American, not just Black Americans, but Black people around the world as well. So like, with his civil rights movement. So like, yeah, um, I'm happy that there's a Martin Luther King Day. Not happy
It took so
how
long.
took so long. Took like 30 plus years for them to campaign for it, and a couple of like celebrities did not know that uh Stevie Wonder did Happy Birthday
Well, I
inspired.
mean, I know he did Happy Birthday. I just
Yeah,
didn't
yeah, yeah,
know.
yeah. He no, he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, the song Happy Birthday, but it was
Yeah.
inspired because of Martin Luther King Day,
Hmm.
and that's amazing as itself. So yeah, great great episode today. So I'm going to end it off right now, guys. So this ends episode 67 of the Next Tape Podcast. The Next Tape Podcast is available now on all podcast platforms. We also have a website called solo TO/ Next Tape Podcast. Tanyka, where else are we at?
We're on Facebook and Instagram at Next Take Podcast and Twitter and TikTok at Next Take Pod.
So you can also contact us on our email. So mikeltanika@gmail.com. That is mikeltanika@gmail.com. So yeah, pretty much we just covered everything from Martin Luther King Day, um, from his background to how the day became, and also his speech as well. So yeah, pretty much that's basically it. Do you want to add anything towards that, Tanika?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think I'm good.
Okay. All right. So I'm Mikel, and
And I'm Tanika.
we're out until next week. Peace,
No,
guys.
no, we're out
Oh,
until Thursday.
till Thursday. I keep saying that because
He's
I'm
gonna
so
get it.
used to, yeah, I'm
He's
gonna get
gonna
it.
get it one day, guys. Don't
Yeah.
worry.
So like, yeah, it's just like, I just gotta go with bro. All right. Thursday. I'll see you then, guys. Peace.
All right. Bye.